So continuing with biomes, we move into aquatic biomes, and I have to say I'm not going to be telling you too much about them. They are vast. It's not fair to them. 71% of the planet is covered by ocean, so is covered by marine biomes. And they are wonderfully interesting, but here in the desert we don't get a lot of chance to study them. So we'll just be touching upon them. They're very important. Water is what drives or is one of the ingredients of photosynthesis. So all of life depends upon the availability of water here on the planet largely. Water, CO2, and sunlight. So this is the set of biomes formed on the continents by rain falling on the continents and slowly running downhill to rejoin with the oceans before it's cycled back up into the atmosphere and drops on the continents again. In the oceans, there are different zones that are sort of divided based upon the depth of the water, the distance from the shoreline, and most importantly, to me anyway, the ability for light to penetrate the surface, how deep it can go down. So where production can occur, where photosynthesis can occur, is in the photic zone at the surface of the oceans. And the depth of the photic zone can change a little bit depending upon how clear the water is. But you've got the photic zone, and then as soon as sunlight can no longer penetrate, you've got the aphotic zone. The photic zone is where all of the green algae that are the base of all of the energy availability for all of these largely oceanic species and ecosystems, that's where it all happens. That's where life is made from inorganic matter and inorganic solar energy. So photic versus non-photic, here in the photic zone where you produce all those green algae, that amount of material being brought into the planet and turned into life is able to support things like, blue whales, gigantic animals. All right, we want to move sort of from what we've been doing, which is a little bit more ecosystem oriented, down to community ecology and look at the assemblages of interacting species and how we can study those interactions, species to species in a community. The most important thing to know about any community is essentially where is the energy and where is the matter. That is what determines how many different kinds of organisms can exist and how complex those interactions between species can become. All ecosystems are based upon producers. These are the things that take CO2 and water and sunlight and couple these inorganic energy and matter sources into organic matter and stored chemical energy as glucose through photosynthesis. And so they build life. All of those things that can photosynthesize, they are called producers, and that is definitely something that's going to be on your exam. Anything else is a consumer. If you are the organism that eats the producer, then you are a primary consumer. If you're an organism that eats the organism that ate the producer, then you are a secondary consumer, and on up through multiple levels of basically trophic levels, consumption levels, as it were. Now, organisms can occupy more than one trophic level. You and I, for instance, we eat animals, so we're obviously at least secondary consumers, but we also eat vegetables, seeds, and that sort of thing. So we're primary consumers also. No matter what, if you're a consumer, you're kind of a parasite on the producers of the planet, the green things. Now, it's one thing to look at a food chain, but in reality, it's more of a food web. And there's a lot of interactions between different species, and species can cross multiple trophic levels, just like we do. So you might be eating seeds at one point. You might be eating insects that ate the plant if you're a frog, but you might also be eating an insect that ate an insect. So you're not only eating a primary consumer, you're eating a secondary consumer. And these interrelationships, they like to say that this, maintains balance. It does to a degree, in the sense that if you start consuming all of one food source and that food source starts to become less frequent, less common, then you can switch to a different food source. And so you never completely exhaust one food source. You're constantly moving to what is most available and easy to get. An interesting thing to note and to remember for an exam is the 10% rule. It's a rule with many exceptions, but basically what it says is that the mass of material you get on any one trophic level is only 10% of the mass, and therefore the energy that was required to build it from the prior trophic level. So your primary consumers are only about 10% of the mass of the producers on which they depend. So the primary consumers eat the producers, but they can only incorporate that energy and that matter into that next trophic level, meaning their bodies, with about a 10% rate of efficiency. And so then if you're the secondary consumer eating the primary consumer, you can only incorporate that mass and that energy into your body mass, and therefore the next trophic level, with about a 10% level of efficiency. The level of efficiency can vary, sometimes below 10%, sometimes 33%. But it's a good overall generalization. And this is why when vegetarians say we could feed 10 times the humanity if we stopped eating meat and just ate vegetables, in a sense they've got a point. Because if you ate the grasses and grains that it took to feed the cow, you'd have 10 times that food available as you would once those things go through the cow. So that is what it's based on. That's what the vegetarians and vegans would base that claim on. It's a valid claim. I'm not advocating that we become vegetarians. I like to cook, and so I like to eat meat too. But it's a valid claim. All right. So as we look at communities, we're looking at interactions between different species. And so we're starting to move not just through community ecology, but also into population ecology, which again is the study of forces that regulate the size of a population in any given region. And sometimes, or very frequently, the things that regulate the size of a population of a specific species is or includes all of those other species around, like competitors or predators, etc. So here's a good table of biological interactions, and this table makes a great set of test questions to ask you on an exam. So make note of it, have it in your notes and available when you take the quiz and when you take the exam on ecology. So let's look at all these different things, what this table means. Neutralism is a relationship between two species. So these first two columns are the two species, and we're looking at the relationship between pairs of species. Neutralism essentially means that neither species cares whether the other species is around. Neither species gains by the presence of the other species, and neither loses by the presence of the other species. Amensalism, below it, essentially is a relationship where one species loses because of the presence of the other species, but the other species really doesn't care that the other species is around. It doesn't affect it one way or another. Commensalism, below that, is a situation where one species doesn't care that the other is present, but that other species is benefiting by the presence of the other species. So one gains, the other doesn't care. Competition is a situation where both species lose by the presence of the other. If the other species weren't around, the one species would have more to eat, would have more territory to live and nest in, etc. So in competition, both species are losing because of the presence of the other. In a relationship of mutualism, it's just the opposite to competition. Both species are benefiting by the presence of the other species. So both species gain by the presence of that other species. And finally, in predation and parasitism, one species is gaining while the other species is losing. So this is a very common one to see in your nature programs when the lion drags down the zebra. Well, the lion's gaining by the presence of the zebra, but the zebra is not gaining. It's losing by the presence of the lion. All right, so we're moving into population ecology, but in looking at population ecology and the factors that regulate population sizes, because so many of those factors are the presence of other species in the community, population ecology and community ecology sort of dovetail together. So let's look at these relationships. Neutralism. There's a lot of plants out there in the desert ecosystem, and here's a tarantula. At least I think it's a tarantula. It looks like one to me. I'm not an arachno person. In any event, the presence of a tarantula, the plants may give it cover or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily benefit one particular plant versus another particular plant. If you took out all the ocotillo, in the area, I don't think the tarantula would necessarily lose anything. And likewise, I don't know if you took out all the tarantulas in an area, whether the ocotillo would lose anything. So there's a lot of relationships out there that approach neutralism in many ecosystems. Amensalism, if you are a spider on the ground or a snake or some other creepy crawly thing, and a herd of elephants comes along, you're going to lose if you're in their way. So you're going to lose by the presence of the herd of elephant, but the herd of elephants really isn't even going to notice that there's a big spider below their feet as they're squashing it. So that might be an example of amensalism. Commensalism, this is the cattle egret and cattle. The cattle egret is a naturally occurring, well, it's naturally occurring all over the world. It is a native to Africa, where it follows around all of the herding animals in the African savanna. I believe it was early last century, in the early 1900s, a small flock of cattle egrets were blown across the Atlantic in a storm and landed in Central South America. Settled there, and the population started to expand. So it was a natural colonization of the New World. And now they're up here in North America around our cattle, and they're in South America too. And what they do is they follow the cattle around, and the cattle grazes and eats, and as it moves, it scares up insects from the grass, and the cattle egrets run and eat those insects. Now, if the cattle egrets weren't there to eat the insects, the cow would still simply do whatever it's doing. The presence of the cattle egret is unimportant to the cattle itself, but the presence of the cattle is important to the cattle egrets. So that is a commensalist relationship. Competition. Hyenas are actually felids. They're you would think they'd be related to dogs, but they're actually members of the cat family. And on the African savanna, they hunt and kill a lot of the same prey items that the prides of lions do. And they are in fierce competition. If one wasn't around, there would be plenty more for the other to eat, and the other would not get killed so much. The hyenas will kill a lion if they find it alone, and they can. And the lions will kill a hyena, apparently any chance they get. So it's a fierce competitive world. If you removed the lions from the area, hyenas would win. If you remove the hyenas from the area, the lions would win. So that's classic competition. Mutualism, this is acacia ants and a acacia shrub in the scrublands of, I believe, South and Central America. But what happens is in these areas here, I believe, the acacia produces a nectar and the ants feed off of it. And so they benefit from the nectar, and they will patrol the acacia and kill any insects that are trying to eat the acacia. So they'll basically patrol it and eat the insects too. But that cleans the acacia. And so the acacia is benefiting by the presence of the ants, and the ants are benefiting by the presence of the acacia. And they've done studies where they take healthy acacia areas and they kill all the ants in the area. And the acacia just get hammered by herbivores eating them. So the acacia definitely lose when the ant isn't there. And they've done the same kind of studies where they've seen the thriving ant populations, and they remove the acacia in an area, and the ant populations suffer tremendously. So it's definitely a mutualistic relationship. Both species benefit by the presence of the other. Finally, we've got in these interactions predation and parasitism. And obviously, if you're the grasshopper in this situation here, you're considering that you have lost, whereas the praying mantis has gained. And if you are the hornworm that is walking along and these little wasp larvae are going to hatch out, burrow into your flesh and eat you, as parasites, you're going to be losing in that interaction. So one species gains, the other wins. That's all for those pairwise biological interactions. This lecture is long enough, so I will pause it and we'll continue in the next.